Somewhere in a windowless lab funded by the United States government, a machine is being built that doesn't fire a single bullet, doesn't carry a warhead, and doesn't look anything like a weapon at all. And yet, defense officials in Beijing and Brussels are reportedly watching its progress with the kind of anxiety usually reserved for missile tests. The machine in question isn't a fighter jet or a submarine. It's a quantum computer, and the agency building it, DARPA, America's most secretive and most influential research arm, believes it might just be the next great weapon of the 21st century, one that doesn't destroy cities, but could quietly unlock every secret currently protected by modern encryption. If that sounds dramatic, that's because it is, and it's also, according to people actually working inside the field, not an exaggeration in the slightest. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is the same organization that funded the earliest version of the internet, helped develop GPS, and has a track record of turning strange, speculative science projects into world-changing technology decades ahead of schedule. When DARPA decides something is worth chasing, the rest of the world usually finds out it was right to be nervous, just a little too late to catch up comfortably. It helps to remember exactly why DARPA carries that reputation in the first place, because it's not hype, it's history. The agency was created in the late 1950s, essentially as a panicked response to the Soviet Union launching Sputnik and catching the United States flat-footed in a technology race nobody saw coming until it was already underway. Ever since, DARPA has operated with a very different mandate than most government research bodies, deliberately funding ideas that sound half crazy on paper, precisely because the ideas that sound half crazy are usually the ones nobody else is willing to touch first. Stealth aircraft, self-driving vehicle research decades before Silicon Valley cared, early brain-computer interface experiments, all of it traces back to the same agency, now quietly pouring resources into quantum computing. If history is any guide, betting against DARPA's long-term instincts has been a consistently bad idea for anyone hoping the future arrives slower than it actually does. So let's talk about what DARPA is actually doing right now, because the details matter more than the headlines, and the details are honestly stranger and more interesting than most people realize. The centerpiece of this effort is something called the Quantum Benchmarking Initiative, or QBI for short. It launched back in 2024 with one deceptively simple-sounding goal: figure out whether a genuinely useful, fault-tolerant quantum computer, one powerful and stable enough that its computational value actually exceeds the enormous cost of building it, can exist by the year 2033. That date matters. It's not some vague, distant someday prediction. It's a real deadline, sitting less than a decade away, and DARPA has structured an entire evaluation pipeline around hitting it. Here's how the process actually works, and it's more rigorous than almost anything else happening in the quantum industry right now. DARPA opened the door to any company on Earth willing to submit a candidate approach for building a real quantum computer, regardless of the underlying technology they were using. Since the program's launch, 20 different commercial companies have had their approaches evaluated, spanning wildly different types of qubits, the fundamental building blocks of quantum information. Some use superconducting circuits cooled to near absolute zero. Others trap individual charged atoms with lasers. Still others try to encode information directly into particles of light. Picture it like several different research teams all trying to build the world's fastest vehicle, except one team insists the future is a race car, another is convinced it's a jet, and a third is betting everything on some kind of hovercraft. Nobody's fully perfected yet. Each vehicle might eventually win under the right conditions, but they can't simply swap parts with each other, and nobody actually knows in advance which design crosses the finish line first, which is exactly why DARPA chose to fund several of these wildly different vehicles at once, instead of picking a favorite too early. Out of that original field, 11 companies advanced into what DARPA calls B, a deeper technical risk reduction phase, where their systems get scrutinized far more aggressively. 2 companies have pushed even further into stage C, where DARPA itself works directly alongside them to verify and validate whether their system actually operates the way it claims to at a system level, not just on paper, a level of hands-on government scrutiny most private technology companies never experience from any federal agency. And in 2026, DARPA didn't slow this process down. It expanded it. The agency reopened the initiative to brand new entrants, explicitly stating it wants to catch any promising approach that hasn't been evaluated yet, worried that narrowing the field too early might mean missing the one idea that actually works. Abstracts for this new round are due by the end of July 2026, with full proposals following 2 months later. Whoever leads the program now put it bluntly in a public statement. It now seems likely that someone, somewhere, will build a genuinely useful quantum computer by 2033. The only real question left is which team crosses that finish line first, and which country they happen to be working for when they do, a phrasing that reads less like typical government press release language and more like an admission that the outcome itself is no longer really in doubt. That last part is the entire reason this program counts as a weapon in the first place, and it's worth slowing down to actually explain why, because the connection between quantum computing and warfare isn't obvious at first glance. Almost everything sensitive in the modern world, military communications, banking systems, intelligence networks, diplomatic cables, is protected using encryption built on math problems that are essentially impossible for a normal computer to solve in any reasonable amount of time. A sufficiently powerful quantum computer, running the right algorithm, could theoretically tear through that same math in a fraction of the time, effectively picking every lock at once. Whoever builds the first machine capable of doing that at scale doesn't just win a science competition. They potentially gain the ability to read a staggering portion of the world's encrypted secrets, both the ones being sent right now and the ones that were intercepted and quietly stored years earlier by patient agencies waiting exactly for this moment. In defense circles, that capability is treated with the same seriousness as a nuclear weapon because, in a very real sense, it functions like one, except it never needs to be launched to have already changed the balance of power. It doesn't flatten a city, it flattens the concept of secrecy itself. There's an additional wrinkle here that makes the threat even more urgent than it might for Saint appear, and it's one intelligence agencies have been quietly exploiting for years already. Adversaries don't actually need a working quantum computer today to start benefiting from one eventually. They simply need to intercept and store encrypted data now, banking it away in vast digital archives, and wait patiently for the day a sufficiently powerful quantum machine finally exists to unlock it. Security researchers call this strategy harvest now, decrypt later, and it transforms the entire quantum race from a future problem into an active present-day one. Sensitive information with a long shelf life, diplomatic communications, weapons designs, intelligence sources, doesn't need to be broken today to already be at risk. It just needs to still matter years from now when the machine capable of reading it finally comes online. That's precisely why DARPA isn't treating 2033 as some far-off, comfortable deadline. Every year between now and then, more of today's secrets are quietly being archived somewhere, waiting. DARPA isn't only betting on one horse in this race either, and this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating from an engineering standpoint. A program manager named Justin Cohen has been running a separate, smaller DARPA initiative built around a problem that sounds almost philosophical. What happens if no single company ever produces the perfect all-purpose quantum computer? Different. Companies are building fundamentally different types of qubits, and each approach has its own strengths and its own crippling weaknesses. Superconducting qubits are fast, but fragile. Trapped ion qubits are remarkably stable, but slower to operate. Photonic qubits travel beautifully over long distances, but are notoriously hard to store. Cohen's program is built around a striking idea. One he's compared to Tolkien's One Ring, a single unifying structure capable of ruling over all of them, or maybe more accurately, to the universal translator from Star Trek. A system that lets fundamentally different, incompatible qubit technologies actually work together inside one combined machine, instead of competing against each other in isolation. Multiple award recipients are receiving up to $2 million apiece to chase pieces of that vision, essentially building the connective tissue that could let America's best superconducting research talk directly to its best trapped ion research, rather than each team racing alone toward the same finish line using totally incompatible tools. There's something almost counterintuitive about this second program once you sit with it, because most competitive races reward the single fastest runner, not the runner willing to share a relay baton with rivals using completely different running styles. Cohen's underlying bet is that quantum computing might not follow that traditional pattern at all. Instead of one architecture eventually dominating the field the way a single smartphone operating system eventually came to dominate mobile phones, different qubit types might end up specializing the same way. Different materials specialize in construction, steel for structure, glass for windows, copper for wiring. A quantum, system blending, superconducting speed with trapped ion stability and photonic distance, all in one coordinated architecture, could theoretically outperform any single approach, chasing perfection in isolation. It's an unusual strategic bet for a defense agency to make, prioritizing cooperation between competing technologies over simply picking a winner and pouring everything into it. That kind of thinking, combining strengths instead of betting everything on a single approach, is exactly the sort of strategic hedge you'd expect from an agency that has learned the hard way that predicting which technology wins a race is often impossible until the race is basically over. But DARPA's quantum ambitions don't stop at building the machine. There's a third program running quietly alongside these two, and it might be the strangest one of all, because instead of building quantum hardware, it's designed to figure out whether other countries are lying about theirs. It's called SciFi, short for the Scientific Feasibility Program, and its entire purpose is to use artificial intelligence to fact-check scientific claims, particularly claims made by rivals about their own military and technological breakthroughs. Think of it as a kind of automated skeptic trained to separate genuine scientific progress from exaggerated or outright fabricated announcements designed purely to unsettle rival nations. The tool itself works in a way that's more nuanced than a simple true or false detector. Rather than just checking whether a claimed result matches known physics, SciFi is designed to reason through feasibility the way an experienced scientist would, weighing whether the described approach could plausibly work given current materials, current engineering limits, and the realistic pace of progress in that specific subfield. One of the researchers involved in building it described the process as going beyond simple validation and replication, calling it a mix of judgment and art rather than a clean mechanical checklist. The ambition doesn't stop at quantum computing either. DARPA has already run similar feasibility sprints, evaluating claims in materials science and artificial intelligence, treating quantum as simply the next major subject in a broader effort to build a standing capability for separating real breakthroughs from strategic noise, wherever that noise happens to originate. The reason SciFi exists in the first place traces directly back to a real, very public scare involving Chinese researchers. Back in the fall of 2024, a team led by a scientist named Wang Chao at Shanghai University published a paper claiming they had used a Canadian-built quantum computer made by a company called D-Wave to successfully attack encryption algorithms tied to the AES standard, the same encryption framework protecting banking systems and military communications around the world. Headline: S exploded almost overnight. Outlets around the world ran stories suggesting China had effectively cracked military-grade encryption using quantum technology, the kind of claim that, if true, would represent one of the single biggest national security shocks in modern history. Here's the twist, and it's an important one. Now, when independent cryptography experts actually dug into the details of what Wang Chao's team had done, the achievement turned out to be far smaller than the headlines suggested. The researchers had successfully factored a 22-bit number using quantum annealing, a specialized and much more limited form of quantum computing than the general-purpose machines DARPA is racing to build. For context, real-world encryption standards rely on numbers that are roughly 2,048 bits long, a gap so enormous that experts describe the comparison as almost meaningless, like claiming you'd conquered Mount Everest because you successfully climbed a large staircase. One cybersecurity researcher put it about as bluntly as possible, pointing out that if China, as the military, had genuinely broken a major global encryption standard, the absolute last thing they would do is publish a peer-reviewed paper announcing it to the entire planet. Quiet, invisible advantage is worth infinitely more to a military than a headline. It's worth understanding exactly what the Shanghai team actually did accomplish, because the real science, even scaled down from the headlines, still says something meaningful. Using a D-Wave advantage machine, a specialized type of quantum computer built around a process called quantum annealing, rather than the more general-purpose approach DARPA is racing to build, the researchers targeted a specific family of algorithms known as substitution permutation networks, the same underlying structure used inside AES, one of the most widely trusted encryption standards on the planet. They successfully attacked smaller, weaker versions of that structure, demonstrating that quantum annealing QL'd, in principle, be combined with traditional mathematical techniques to chip away at certain categories of cryptographic problems. Now, that's genuinely interesting research. It's also nowhere close to threatening the actual encryption protecting real-world military or financial systems today, which rely on numbers vastly larger than anything in the published experiment. And yet, even after the hype got walked back, the fear it created didn't fully disappear. And that lingering fear is precisely the problem DARPA's SciFi program is trying to solve at a systemic level. Reports of Chinese quantum breakthroughs, real or exaggerated, create genuine pressure inside the American defense establishment, sometimes pushing enormous amounts of funding and attention toward chasing what might turn out to be a scientific mirage. That fear does real damage on its own, regardless of whether the underlying claim was true, distracting resources and attention away from problems that might matter more. An AI system trained specifically to evaluate the actual feasibility, or also have an adversary's claimed breakthrough, rather than simply reacting to how alarming a headline sounds, could theoretically save the Pentagon from chasing its own shadow over and over again. It's a strange kind of weapon in its own right, one built not to attack anyone directly, but to prevent the country from panicking itself into bad decisions. Step back for a second and look at the shape of what DARPA has actually assembled here, because it's more sophisticated than a single race toward a single machine. One program is building the hardware itself, racing dozens of competing approaches toward a real deadline. A second program is trying to make sure whichever approach wins doesn't win by accident, blending the strongest pieces of multiple technologies together instead of gambling everything on one horse. A third program exists purely to keep the whole country's judgment honest, filtering out genuine breakthroughs from expensive distractions dressed up as breakthroughs. That's not just funding a science project. That's building an entire strategic apparatus around a technology still years away from actually working, which tells you everything about how seriously the people inside these agencies are taking the stakes. If you're enjoying this kind of behind-the-scenes look at the technology quietly shaping global power, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because there's plenty more of this coming. Now let's talk about why China and Europe are, in the words of plenty of defense analysts, genuinely scrambling to respond, because America isn't operating in a vacuum here, and the reaction from the rest of the world has been anything but quiet. China's own quantum ambitions run deep and predate most of DARPA's current push by years. Chinese researchers and state-backed labs have poured enormous resources into quantum communication specifically, an area where China has arguably led the world for the better part of a decade, including satellite-based quantum key distribution experiments that stunned Western scientists when they were first demonstrated. The country holds a substantial share of global quantum-related patents and has treated quantum research as a strategic pillar on par with its ambitions in artificial intelligence and semiconductor independence. The Shanghai University encryption scare, even after being walked back by outside experts, wasn't purely empty theater either. It reflected a genuine, ongoing effort inside China to push quantum computing into exactly the domain DARPA is most worried about: code-breaking and military-grade cryptographic attack. The claim was exaggerated. The underlying ambition driving the research almost certainly wasn't. To really appreciate why China's quantum communications lead worries American strategists so much, it helps to understand what that lead actually looks like in practice. Back in 2016, China launched a satellite specifically built to test quantum key distribution from orbit, successfully demonstrating that quantum-secured communication could work across distances far beyond what fiber optic cables on the ground could reliably manage. That experiment, once dismissed by some Western scientists as more of a publicity stunt than a serious technical milestone, has since become a foundational reference point for an entire category of secure satellite communication research, now being pursued by multiple countries. China followed that early demonstration with a growing terrestrial quantum communication network connecting several major cities, an infrastructure investment far more extensive than anything comparable currently operating in the United States or Europe. None of that guarantees China wins the broader quantum computing race DARPA is focused on. Communications and computation are genuinely different technical challenges, but it does mean China isn't simply reacting to America's moves from several steps behind. In at least one meaningful corner of this overall race, it's arguably been running out in front for the better part of a decade. Europe's response has taken a very different shape, less about a single dramatic headline and more about institutional urgency finally catching up to reality. In March of 2026, the European Commission proposed something called Agile, a fast-track funding mechanism explicitly designed to push emerging defense technologies, including quantum computing, alongside artificial intelligence and autonomous drone systems, from early-stage research into actual deployment far faster than the European Union's notoriously slow existing bureaucratic pipelines ever allowed. The plan didn't emerge out of nowhere. It followed a blunt internal admission that Europe's existing pace of defense innovation was letting other global powers, explicitly naming the United States and China, set the timeline in critical technology areas while European nations lagged behind, watching from the sidelines. That admission is worth sitting with, because European institutions rarely describe their own shortcomings in such direct terms in public policy documents. For years, European defense innovation had been widely criticized as slow and fragmented compared to both American and Chinese efforts, hamstrung by the need to coordinate funding, priorities, and procurement across dozens of member states, each protecting their own national defense industries. Recent conflicts closer to Europe's own borders appear to have sharpened that self-criticism considerably, exposing just how quickly modern warfare has shifted toward exactly the kind of cheap, networked, technology-driven capability that traditional European defense spending patterns were never really built to produce quickly. Agile represents an attempt to shortcut around that historical slowness entirely, explicitly designed to compress years of typical bureaucratic review into a fraction of the time, treating speed itself as a strategic asset rather than an afterthought. Agile sits inside a much larger financial commitment too, part of a broader push called Rearm Europe. Backed by over 800 billion euros earmarked to modernize the continent's defense industry and reduce its dependence on outside powers for critical military technology. That kind of number, 800 billion euros, is worth pausing on because it puts the scale of this quiet arms race into real perspective. This isn't a handful of research grants scattered across a few university labs. It's a continent-wide restructuring of how defense innovation gets funded and deployed, explicitly motivated by the fear of falling behind in exactly the kind of frontier technology DARPA has spent the last 2 years aggressively racing toward. When you place America's quantum benchmarking initiative, China's decade of quantum communications investment, and Europe's newly urgent agile plan side by side, what you're actually looking at isn't 3 separate stories. It's one story told from 3 different capitals, all circling the same terrifying and exciting realization at almost exactly the same time. There's a broader military philosophy shift tangled up in all of this too, one that goes beyond quantum computing specifically, but helps explain why DARPA is treating this technology with such urgency in the first place. Defense researchers have started describing a new category of conflict, sometimes called the 6th domain, defined not by geography, land, sea, air, space, cyber, but by something stranger. A battlefield where autonomy and networked systems allow astonishingly cheap consumer-grade electronics to destroy conventional weapons systems costing millions of dollars apiece. Quantum technology fits directly into that emerging philosophy, not as a single, flashy weapon, but as an invisible layer underneath everything else, deciding whose networks stay secure, whose communications stay hidden, and whose encrypted secrets eventually become readable to someone else. In a world increasingly shaped by cheap, networked, software-driven warfare, the country that controls the mathematics underneath all of it holds a kind of leverage that doesn't show up on a traditional battlefield at all. Recent conflicts have already offered a glimpse of what that shift looks like in practice, even without quantum computing playing a direct role yet. Cheap commercial drones, sometimes costing only a few hundred or a few $1,000s, have hardware worth tens of millions of dollars, forcing defense planners around the world to rethink assumptions that had held steady for decades about what actually constitutes a decisive military advantage. That same logic extends naturally into the digital and cryptographic realm. A quantum computer capable of breaking an adversary's encrypted command and control network wouldn't need to fire a single shot to cripple an entire... simply by exposing troop movements, supply routes, or communications that were supposed to remain hidden. Its warfare fought entirely in the space between visibility and secrecy, and quantum computing sits right at the center of deciding which side gets to see and which side gets seen. It's also worth understanding that none of this is actually new territory for DARPA, even if the current scale is unprecedented. Back in the early 2000s, DARPA quietly built and operated the world's very first quantum key distribution network, a system using the strange physics of quantum mechanics to detect eavesdropping on secure communications, running continuously under the streets of Boston and Cambridge for more than 3 years. That project barely made headlines at the time. Most people, including plenty of technology enthusiasts, had no idea it existed until years after it had already been shut down. DARPA has effectively been laying groundwork in this exact field for more than 2 decades, patiently building expertise and institutional knowledge, long before the rest of the world started paying attention. That early network, small and largely forgotten outside specialist circles, quietly proved out foundational technology that modern quantum communication research still leans on today, including the first working superconducting nanowire single photon detector, a piece of hardware still considered essential for detecting the individual particles of light that carry quantum-encoded information across a network. It's a useful reminder that breakthroughs in this field rarely arrive as sudden, singular events. They accumulate quietly over decades, built on unglamorous, patiently funded groundwork that almost nobody notices, until the pieces finally click together into something the public actually hears about. What's different now isn't that DARPA suddenly discovered quantum technology. It's that the technology has finally matured to the point where the theoretical threats researchers have been quietly discussing for 20 years are starting to look genuinely achievable within a defined near-term timeline. That shift from theoretical to achievable is exactly what's driving the sense of urgency, rippling outward from Washington to Beijing to Brussels right now. A threat that might arrive in 50 years barely moves government budgets. A threat with a real, specific target date attached to it, 2033, backed by a rigorous, multi-stage evaluation process, already narrowing down which companies actually have a shot at hitting it, moves budgets very quickly indeed. DARPA didn't just announce an ambition. It built an entire verification pipeline designed to prove, stage by stage, whether that ambition is realistic, and every time another company survives into the next stage, it sends a quiet signal to rival governments that the clock is ticking faster than they might have assumed. Skeptics, and there are plenty of serious ones inside the quantum research community itself, We'll point out that fault-tolerant, utility-scale quantum computing has been perpetually 5 to 10 years away from most of the field's existence, a moving target that keeps sliding forward every time it gets close. Building a machine stable enough to actually outperform classical computers on real-world problems, rather than narrow laboratory demonstrations, remains one of the hardest unsolved engineering challenges on the planet. Quantum states are notoriously fragile, and errors compound quickly unless you can correct them faster than they accumulate, a problem researchers have been grinding against for decades without a fully satisfying solution. DARPA's own 2033 target could easily slip, the same way plenty of ambitious government technology deadlines have slipped before it. Betting an entire national security strategy on a specific year is inherently risky when the underlying physics doesn't care about deadlines at all. History offers plenty of cautionary examples worth remembering here too. Fusion energy has famously been described as perpetually 30 years away for the better part of a century, a running joke inside the physics community that captures just how easily ambitious timelines can quietly slip decade after decade without the underlying goal ever actually arriving. Quantum computing. Researchers themselves have offered similarly humbling admissions in recent years, acknowledging that early predictions about when useful, error-corrected quantum machines would finally arrive have already been revised backward more than once. As the true difficulty of the engineering became clearer, none of that means DARPA's benchmarking effort is wasted money. Even a program that ultimately misses its 2033 target by several years will likely still produce genuinely useful scientific progress along the way. It simply means nobody, including the researchers closest to the work, should treat that date as a guaranteed certainty rather than an ambitious, carefully structured bet. But even accounting for that healthy skepticism, the strategic posture on display right now is telling in its own right, regardless of whether 2033 turns out to be the real finish line or just another optimistic milestone that quietly gets pushed back later. Nations don't typically commit hundreds of billions of dollars, restructure entire funding bureaucracies, and stand up specialized AI fact-checking programs in response to threats they consider distant or unlikely. I do it when the people closest to the research, the ones actually inside the labs looking at real experimental results rather than press releases, start believing the timeline has genuinely compressed. Whether or not DARPA's specific 2033 deadline holds exactly, the underlying signal that quantum computing has crossed from speculative science fiction into a genuine, trackable, near term strategic race appears to be one that Washington, Beijing, and Brussels have all quietly arrived at independently and almost simultaneously. So where does that actually leave things? Somewhere in a lab you'll never see the inside of? A handful of companies are edging closer to building a machine that could, if the physics finally cooperates, rewrite the rules of secrecy itself. Nobody knows yet which qubit technology wins, whether America's benchmarking pipeline actually delivers a working system by its stated deadline, or whether China's quiet decade-long head start in quantum communications ends up mattering more than a flashy race toward code breaking. What's clear is that the world's major powers have stopped treating this as a distant hypothetical and started treating it as a life. Strategic contest, complete with real deadlines, real funding commitments, and real institutional urgency behind closed doors. That urgency shows up in strange, almost mundane ways if you know where to look. F for it, a new funding line quietly added to a defense budget, a fresh batch of company names appearing in a government solicitation, a policy document in Brussels admitting the continent has fallen behind. None of it looks like the opening of a war movie. It looks like paperwork, spreadsheets, and press releases most people will never bother reading past the headline. And yet paperwork like this, accumulated patiently over years, is exactly how the balance of global power has quietly shifted before, long before any of it became obvious enough for the general public to notice in real time. The next great weapon might never be fired, never be seen, and never make the news the way a missile test does. It might simply exist quietly inside a server rack, waiting for the day it finally works. And by the time the rest of the world understands exactly what it can do, the country that built it first will already be several steps ahead. Whatever happens next, one truth already seems settled. The age of treating quantum computing as a distant academic curiosity is over, and the age of treating it as a live strategic asset has already quietly begun. If you found this breakdown interesting, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more of these deep dives, and let us know in the comments which country you think actually crosses the quantum finish line first.